Alright, this is Becca, often going by Nightcat or Nightcat's Meow online, here for the second in my series on teaching scripting with Linden Scripting Language. Welcome back. Now, if you recall our little lesson last week, just a review, we had it for click invisible, click visible. We also had commands for on and off. And I talked about this being used for weapon draws across the grid. So I've gone ahead and prepared the sword in the cube. This little sword that I've made took me a couple of minutes, made with basic prims, the kind that you can get access to just by coming into Second Life, and a couple of textures, is available as a freebie on the Second Life marketplace, so that you can go and get it. The link's down in the description. You can go ahead and pause this video, take a couple of minutes, go get the sword, and then you'll be able to follow along with these lessons. We're going to expand on what we learned last week to where we'll be able to control both parts of the draw and sheath, or the visible and invisible, simultaneously, with one able to trigger the other. And we're also going to explore creating a HUD device for this. Now, the easiest way to prepare is going to be to move this script into the sword. So if you just open any part of your inventory, it really does not matter where. You take this script here. For convenience, we're going to rename it Visible Toggle. Copy that over into inventory. Then you look at the inventory of the sword. Put the visible toggle in there. If you do not select any particular part, it will automatically go in the root, which is right here. And as we learned last week, that means it will control the entire object. Now we no longer need our boxes from before, so we're going to retire the boxes. And as you see, that continues to work on click and on command, just like it did last week, exactly as we would expect. Now, when you're dealing with a draw and a sheath, what you actually have are two copies of one object. We'll get to that in a moment because we're actually going to make this a little simpler to work with. The first new concept I'm going to introduce you to is creating a global function. This is just like when we created a global variable sitting above the default state. We're going to call this show. Any function needs to have these parentheses to contain arguments, though this will not need any, and it needs the brackets to contain its operations. We're also going to put in hide the same way. Now the easiest way to set these up is going to be to just simply copy code from down here. For on, that is show. So a simple copy, Control V, Control C. Then just line that up because it looks prettier and makes it easier to read and review. That's always more important when you have bigger scripts. And we're just going to copy from off into hide. This is going to be very useful and is standard practice in a lot of other programming languages. If you're going to repeat the same operation in a lot of places, the easiest way to do it, and the way to reduce your chance of errors, is to create your own function for it. So now down here, we'll replace all of this with show, have the parentheses, and of course your semicolon. Up here, it's a container. Down here, it's a command. So down here, it gets a semicolon. And we'll do the same thing here, replacing all of this with hide. Basically what it means is we've made a shorthand. We've taken this set of commands and said, this means do this. That simple. We could even put the same thing down here. Show. Hide. And save it to compile. Compile successful. Save complete. Close out our menu options. Minimize that. I click it. Nothing happens. On. Off. On. Off. It works just fine. Clicking it does nothing. The problem is I inserted them in the wrong places. This is a thing you'll have to be very careful of. In the case of visibility, we want to give it hide, which means show goes here. It's a very easy mistake to make. Even I can make it sometimes. So we correct that. It still compiles just fine. And now it works just fine. Off, on, off, on. So now that you've seen how to do that with your own global function, by moving it up here, we've seen that you have to make sure that you have the right settings on here. What was happening before is with show, under visible equals true, show sets visible true. It never changed it. When visible was false, because of using the command, and it was showing hide, it was keeping it false. It was triggering the same toggle, which is why it wasn't working. Now, the thing is, in almost every case of a weapon draw and sheath, you're not dealing with just one object. You're dealing, in fact, with two. The one that is in your hand and the one that is on your avatar, where it is stored, sheathed, however you have it. So, we're just going to copy this with a simple shift and drag. Now with this one, we're going to change the function a little bit. The command on is going to hide it. And the command off is going to show it. Close that. Now, right now, if you use the command on, you get the one there. Off, it switches. On, off. So right now, you can draw this blade with a command. In fact, here's a nice little trick with SL. You can highlight things that are invisible. Code example sword sheathed. Code example sword drawn. We're going to take those both, go to the recent objects, add, that puts that right on my hip there, then attach to right hand, so you see the one in my hand, on the hip, in the hand, on the hip, in the hand. That's exactly how that works. That's how every one of them in SL works. We'll turn off the thing to show invisible objects. Detach both of those. Need invisible again. Res those both back into the world. Now here's where we start getting into a little more of what you can do with a listen. You don't want just anybody controlling your sword. You want to make sure you are the only one that controls your sword. Now if you remember in last week's lesson, when we set up the listen, we set up null key right here. That meant that it didn't matter what key was originating the command. Here, we're going to replace that with LL get owner. What this does is this automatically, when the script starts, when it enters the default state entry, so when it enters the default state, it applies state entry, everything in these brackets. It activates the listen, and it asks, who is my owner? Who does this object belong to? You could manually put a key in here. This checks for it automatically. Much simpler. Save, compile successful. And because we're dealing with two objects now, we have to do that for both objects. So again, we replace null key with LL get owner. Now only the owner of the sword can trigger them. There is another way to do that that will allow another object to do this, but that's going to be a bit more complicated. We are going to deal with that, but it's going to be a bit more complicated. Also, you may find different blades would have a sound when they're drawn. We'll get to those in another week. Might have an animation when it's drawn. We'll get to that in another week. But what we're going to get to first is right now, you've lost the ability to control them both by touch. You can only control one or the other. But you may want to keep them connected, keep them in sync. We do that a little differently. Now, here's a dirty little secret of most programmers. Even we can't always keep track of every tiny little thing. Sometimes we keep notes. In my case, this is one of the ones I keep notes on. Right there. What is that? Why do I have that there? We'll get to that in a moment. First off, we're going to go back into here. We're going to take this back to a null key. Bear in mind, you can use the get owner if you're going to run it by a command. That's all you have to do. Only if you want to have another object provide the command do you have to go through all this. What I am about to show you is how HUDs that control objects work. We'll even make a HUD object, but we're going to start by just adapting the touch controls. So we're going to take this back to null key. We're going to go down here. The person who did this preferred to use ID, where I prefer to use who, so we're just going to change that to who. What this says is if get owner key equals who, that's the key up here, since it's going to come from an object, this is why we use the get owner key, because this will get a key of whatever it comes from. If it comes from an avatar, it'll have the avatar's key. If it comes from an object, it will have the object's key. Get owner key who asks who owns the key that I heard this message from. And then we'll encapsulate all this other code inside brackets. So this is a container if the owner of whatever key provided the message that is being listened to is equal to my owner. Then do these. If you, the owner of the script, do it, then you are the owner of your own key. So that'll still match. That'll work just fine. So we're going to take that, save this, copy it over here, save. Right now, though, this one is not going to work because it still has get owner here, which means it would have to be the owner's key to respond there. So we're going to take this back to null key. There you go. Now it will actually run that comparison. Save. And you'll say right now, it still works exactly as it did. Off. On. Off. Exactly as it was before. So we're going to edit, open this back up. Here's where we turn it into one sword's ability to control the other. Here at the touch start, when it triggers hide, as this sword goes invisible, which would mean the other one would go visible. We're going to make it LL say. That causes it to speak the command. We're still operating on channel 0. We'll worry about changing channels later. Having your commands on channel 0 is not a thing you normally want to do. It gets very annoying to other people around you. But for purposes of this demonstration, it's okay. And then quotation marks, since you're dealing with a string like we learned last week, off. And then down here, say, channel 0, quotation marks for dealing with a string. Forgive the typos. Close the parentheses for the arguments and give it the semicolon. Save. So you see, when we click the first sword, it turns itself off and turns on the other sword. The other sword hasn't been changed, so it doesn't do anything yet. But we're going to do the same thing over there. Now, this one, message equals on, triggers hide. So that's how you can remind yourself which message to use. You want that to correspond to the message it's receiving. If this one receives the message on, it triggers hide. So if you're triggering a hide because of the touch toggle, you want to send that same message. So LL, say, or just speak this message on channel 0, insert your string, on, close your parentheses, or close your quotation marks, close your parentheses, give it your semicolon. Then on this one, say, channel 0, off. It's just a mirror opposite of the first one we did. Save that one. Close it. And now either one, can toggle the other. That's exactly how that works. That's all there is to that. And if I turn off the show invisible, it becomes a little clearer. Now, a lot of times, somebody will create a HUD device, a simple attachment that goes on your main viewing area here that will manipulate objects. All that does is exactly what we just did. It's all stuff you've already learned. We'll make this box your HUD toggle. So we'll create a new script. Start with the global variable, integer, just like before, out equals false. We don't need a listen on this one. Touch start if out equals true, out equals false. Like I said, this is all exactly like last week's lesson. So we say LL say 0 off. This is again just like we were doing to make the swords control each other. Return. Else, since you only have two possible modes, out equals true. Say 0. Actually, accidentally put a period instead of a comma there. Another thing to watch out for, those typos will get you every time. Return. Save. Successful. And this button will switch the two swords, no problem. So we'll take this button, edit it, sword HUD. Make sure you rename it because that's going to be important for the last thing we're going to learn this lesson. Take the sword HUD. In recent objects, it'll be right there. Attach to HUD. We'll just let it, there it is. There's our sword HUD. Just pops between those, no problem. Now, the last thing we're going to cover today is the last little bit of security up here. One of the things you can do to keep stuff going back and forth across multiple objects sorted out is, I told you last week that this section of listen, the second argument of listen, is for what is saying a thing. So we'll make that sword HUD, which is the name we gave over here, sword HUD. Now, only if the object saying it is called sword HUD will the listen pay any attention. Otherwise, it will ignore it. If you type this out yourself, it will ignore you. If it comes from the sword HUD, it will pass it on, where the listen will see, does the key of the person owning sword HUD match the key of my owner? If yes, it will then process things here. Is the message on? Is the message off? Where did I put that other sword? There's the other sword. And again here, sword HUD, save. Still triggers just fine. I type it. Nothing. I click the sword, it still controls itself. That's because we left the touch controls on. but it doesn't control the other sword, because the other sword is listening for sword HUD, and it is not named sword HUD. So, at that point, you would go in here. If you remember comments, you can just use these little 2 forward slashes to turn off every line for the touch control, everything between those 2 brackets, to turn that off completely. And do that for the other one. Now, if for whatever reason you needed to go back and reference this code, it's still there, it still exists, but when the script compiles, it's ignored because it's commented. So now clicking the swords does nothing. Clicking the sword HUD will control them. We're going to take, add both swords, bring my camera around, click the HUD, there it is on my hip, there it is on my hand. Hip, hand, hip, hand. And that is how you appear to draw a weapon in SL. Next week, we'll talk about how to have a sheath for this sword that will remain visible on your hip, and we'll refine a couple of the other security options and show you a few other ways of sending information from your HUD to your weapon in a manner that will cause the least amount of disruption to the rest of the sim. And you can continue your wonderful journey into the world of programming. Thanks again. See you in a week.